by the year 2035, leading management consultants they're projecting that a single emerging technology is going to unlock up to $2.7 trillion in global economic value.
Which is just a massive, almost incomprehensible number.
Right. I mean, for context, that is roughly the entire gross domestic product of a country like France.
Right.
And they're saying this will be generated by one specific tech sector in less than a decade.
Yeah.
But there is a massive catch here. The physical machines that are supposed to generate this unprecedented wealth, they're currently sitting in these freezing cryogenic chambers or suspended in complex laser arrays, and they're essentially doing nothing of commercial value.
Basically nothing.
And that's because almost nobody on Earth actually knows how to ask them the right questions yet.
It's honestly the ultimate paradox of modern technology right now. I mean, we are building the most sophisticated calculation engines in human history. These are machines that leverage the fundamental, bizarre rules of quantum mechanics. But we are facing this massive translation gap. The hardware is arriving, but the corporate capacity to actually use it is just lagging dangerously behind.
So if you're running a business right now, or even if you're just trying to manage your own personal investments, you are probably hearing the deafening noise around quantum computing here in the year 2026. Like the hype is absolutely everywhere.
Oh, it's inescapable.
It really is. We are constantly told we're at this commercial tipping point, right? Where private enterprise is officially taking the reins from government labs. But before you start banking on those multi-trillion-dollar projections, we need to offer a serious warning. The math behind those numbers might involve some incredibly clever accounting.
Clever and, honestly, in some cases, fundamentally flawed, especially if you look closely at the baselines they are using to calculate that future value.
Exactly. So our mission today on this deep dive is to separate the sci-fi fantasy from the boardroom reality. We're going to look under the hood of the quantum computing industry to understand not just what the market is doing, but why and how this technology actually functions today.
And to do this, we're pulling from a very specific, pretty dense stack of intelligence.
Very dense. We're breaking down major industry benchmarks, including the Boston Consulting Group's latest analysis, specifically a piece they put out called CEOs Need to Shape Where Quantum Creates Value, and also the massive McKinsey Quantum Technology Monitor 2026.
Yeah, and we are also looking at the QEDC State of the Global Quantum Industry 2026 report, which is essential because it tracks the actual flow of capital and the movement of the workforce.
Which shows where the money's actually going.
Exactly. It tells us where the money and the brains are moving rather than just, where PR departments claim they're going.
Right, and we aren't just reading corporate projections here.
Yeah.
To get a real sense of the landscape, we're balancing those optimistic reports with a highly critical, really meticulous teardown of McKinsey's methodology. And that comes from a platform called postquantum.com, along with some geopolitical analysis from All About Industries.
Because that friction between the optimistic projections and the harsh critiques, that is exactly where we are going to find the actual state of the industry. I mean, you simply cannot understand quantum in 2026 without looking at both the grand promises and the fierce internal debates over how we even measure progress.
For sure. So before we get into the global race to build these machines and the physical engineering bottlenecks, which are, frankly, fascinatingly mundane.
So mundane. Plumbing and wires, basically.
Right. Before we get into all that, we need to start by understanding the sheer scale of the financial stakes being claimed here. Let's look at those mind-boggling numbers from the McKinsey 2026 monitor. They are projecting that the internal quantum market is going to reach between $60 billion and $100 billion worldwide by 2035.
And we should probably clarify what internal market even means in this context.
Yeah, break that down.
So this is the market for the technology itself, the hardware, the specialized software, the consulting services. If we use a gold rush analogy, the $60 to $100 billion internal market is the economy of selling the pickaxes, the shovels, and the maps to the miners.
Okay.
So it is a very substantial market on its own.
But I noticed that just last year, McKinsey's lower bound estimate for that exact same internal market was only $28 billion.
Yeah.
So in a single year, they've aggressively revised their optimism upward.
Highly aggressive.
But even a $100 billion shovel market kind of pales in comparison to the gold they think we are going to dig up. That is where they dropped the staggering figure of $1.3 trillion to $2.7 trillion in overall economic value generated globally by 2035.
Trillions. By 2035, I mean, that is a timeline of just 9 years from today.
It's wild. Let's compare that to the reality we're living in right now in 2025. According to the QEDC report, The global quantum computing market generated $1.4 billion in actual revenue, and quantum sensing, which is a related but distinct field, generated $470 million. Now, I will grant that the computing side is growing fast, like around 30% annually, and it is expected to hit $3 billion by 2028. But projecting a jump from $1.4 billion today to $2.7 trillion in economic value in 9 years, it's a leap. It's not just a hockey stick projection. That is drawing a vertical line on a graph and calling it a trend. I really have to push back on this. How do they even calculate economic value? Like, if a massive global shipping company uses a quantum algorithm to save 5% on its fuel costs, are the analysts just sweeping the whole shipping company's revenue into the quantum value bucket?
You've identified the core tension in these massive market reports right there. The $1.4 billion today is real revenue changing hands. The $2.7 trillion figure is what they call value at stake.
Value at stake, okay.
Yeah. It represents hypothetical cost savings, efficiency gains, and newly unlocked revenue streams across massive trillion-dollar legacy industries. So we're talking pharmaceuticals, global finance, international logistics.
So they aren't saying the quantum companies make that money.
Exactly. McKinsey isn't claiming that quantum startups will earn $2.7 trillion in revenue. They are claiming the technology will unlock that much value within the broader economy.
Okay, but even with that distinction, the assumption that the technology will integrate that smoothly and flawlessly across all those sectors feels highly suspect.
Very much so.
Especially when you look at the research from the Boston Consulting Group, because their data suggests that the technology working perfectly might not even be the primary hurdle we face.
Right. The BCG report identifies what they call the value gap, and it is perhaps the most sobering insight from their survey of over 200 large companies. They project that we are going to see incredible quantum hardware capabilities arriving by 2030. I mean, the roadmaps from the major players are ambitious, but they are largely hitting their milestones.
The physical machines are getting better.
They are. But the software instructions, the application algorithms needed to actually point these brilliant machines at a real-world business problem, they're practically non-existent. Yeah. BCG warns that we are heading toward a scenario where we have super machines sitting idle, basically gathering dust, because corporate enterprises haven't figured out how to formulate their problems in a way the machine can actually understand.
To understand why this is such a profound bottleneck, we need to look at how different quantum programming is from classical programming. Because it's not like you just take your existing Python code, run it through a compiler, hit a translate to quantum button, and watch your program run a billion times faster.
No, absolutely not. It is an entirely different paradigm of logic.
Because classical computing relies on deterministic bits, zeros and ones. It's a series of binary switches, true or false.
Yes, but quantum computing uses qubits. And qubits leverage the bizarre rules of quantum mechanics, specifically superposition and entanglement.
Break those down for us really quick.
Sure. Superposition basically means the qubit can exist in a complex combination of both 0 and 1 simultaneously, right up until the moment you measure it. It's not just a switch that is on or off. It's spinning in a cloud of probabilities.
Entanglement.
Entanglement means the state of one qubit can be intrinsically linked to the state of another, even over a distance, so that changing one instantly affects the other.
Right. So when you're programming for that, you aren't writing a straightforward set of linear instructions like you do on a MacBook. You have to take your business problem, say, optimizing a massive global supply chain, and translate it into a highly complex mathematical model. It's like a landscape of probabilities that the quantum system can process all at once.
And that translation is incredibly difficult. BCG points out that if end users don't start doing the hard work of translating their specific business constraints into quantum-ready problems right now, the hardware revolution won't matter at all.
It's just a giant, expensive paperweight.
Exactly. It is a crisis of organizational capacity. It's not just about the technology catching up to our needs, it's about the enterprises catching up to the technology.
The sources actually mention a very specific attempt to bridge this gap. The NQAC, the National Quantum Algorithm Center at the Illinois Quantum and Microelectronics Park. This is a public-private partnership explicitly designed to address this exact value gap.
Right. It's an initiative to basically force co-innovation. You take the academic physicist who understands the deep math of the qubit, and you put them into the same room as the enterprise logistics manager who understands the messy reality of shipping routes, driver schedules, and, fuel costs.
Because the logistics manager can't just walk up to the machine and type, "Make my trucks deliver packages faster."
I wish, but no.
Right. The physicist has to help them translate traffic patterns and vehicle capacities into a quantum algorithm that maps onto the physical qubits. And without that painstaking translation process, the trillion-dollar value simply vanishes.
And this brings us to a fierce debate happening within the industry itself. Because while the hardware companies are sprinting ahead and the software translation is lagging, these massive financial projections are still pointing to the stratosphere.
Which feels disconnected from reality.
It does. The skepticism we have about those trillion-dollar figures is absolutely shared by deeply embedded experts in the field.
I want to look closely at the analysis from postquantum.com here. Because they took the McKinsey Quantum Technology Monitor, read the exact same $2.7 trillion projection that we just talked about, and basically tore the methodology apart. They literally call it the value at stake shell game.
Well, you have to remember, industry reports from major consultancies serve a specific purpose.
To drum up business.
Basically, yes. They are designed to signal momentum to the market, to encourage investment. But because of that, they are inherently optimistic documents, and they often make broad assumptions that need to be critically examined.
Let's examine their assumption regarding the pharmaceutical industry. McKinsey claims that pharmaceuticals will see between $50 and $400 billion in value, specifically derived from quantum acceleration.
That's a huge range, first of all.
Yeah, 50 to 400 billion. And they arrive at that number by projecting a 5 to 20% savings in research and development costs and a 5 to 15% savings in clinical trials.
Now, the theoretical use case there is sound. Quantum computers, because they operate on the rules of quantum mechanics, are uniquely suited to simulate molecular interactions and chemical reactions.
Because molecules themselves follow quantum rules.
Exactly. Simulating nature is exactly what a quantum machine should eventually do better than anything else. So in theory, you could model how a drug interacts with a protein perfectly in the computer, meaning you have to do far less physical trial and error in a wet lab.
Okay, but postquantum points out a fatal flaw in the math here. McKinsey is measuring these projected 2035 quantum savings against the classical computing methods we're using right now in 2026.
And that is a massive analytical error. You simply cannot freeze classical technology in time while projecting quantum technology a decade into the future.
It's like predicting the economic value of a massive cross-country high-speed rail network that will be finished in 10 years. But you calculate the time saved by comparing the train speed to a horse and buggy.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. You are completely ignoring the fact that standard cars and commercial airplanes are also going to get much faster, more efficient, and cheaper by the time the train is actually built.
And classical computing is absolutely not standing still. Just look at the explosion in classical artificial intelligence over the last few years, specifically in the very fields McKinsey is analyzing.
AlphaFold is a great example.
Yes. Models like AlphaFold, running on standard classical silicon chips, have already revolutionized protein folding and pharmaceutical R&D. By 2035, classical AI is going to be unimaginably more powerful than it is today.
Which obviously moves the goalpost for quantum. If a pharmaceutical giant in 2035 is going to spend millions of dollars for time on a quantum computer, that quantum machine doesn't just have to be better than a human scientist in a lab today. It has to be significantly economically better than whatever hyper-advanced classical AI system they will already have running on standard servers in 2035.
This is why the post-quantum author stresses the critical need for dynamic baselines. You have to project where classical computing and AI will naturally be in 2035 based on current trajectories, and then you measure quantum's incremental advantage over that moving target.
And when you do that?
When you do that, quantum computing still generates real, tangible value, but it is vastly smaller than $2.7 trillion.
Post-quantum uses their own CRQC, the Quantum Capability Framework, to suggest that the absolute lower bound of McKinsey's estimate, the 1.3 trillion, is a much more realistic ceiling. And honestly, even that lower number assumes that quantum computing will only excel at very specific, high-value niche tasks within a broader workflow, rather than replacing classical computing entirely.
It completely shifts the narrative from a technology that replaces everything to a technology that changes a few very specific, highly complex things.
And the critique from post-quantum doesn't stop at the future projections. They point out that even the data tracking the present day, like the reported $12.6 billion in startup investments over the last few years, is incredibly murky because of how the financial markets operate.
We are talking about the issue of tracking funding data in an intensely hyped market. It gets very muddy.
Exactly. Post-quantum brings up the issue of SPACs, special purpose acquisition companies. Let's break down why this obscures the reality of quantum funding. A SPAC is essentially a blank check shell company that raises money through an IPO and then looks for a private company to merge with.
It's a backdoor to Wall Street.
Right. It takes that private company public without the traditional rigorous IPO scrutiny.
And it became a very popular vehicle for deep tech companies to go public quickly during the recent tech booms.
But post-quantum asks a pointed question here. When a company like IonQ or another hybrid deep tech firm goes public via a SPAC, how much of their massive market capitalization actually reflects pure quantum value versus broader AI and deep tech positioning?
Because these companies are rarely doing just quantum research. They are doing classical machine learning, advanced material science, maybe some cloud infrastructure.
It is the AI washing phenomenon, but applied to a new buzzword.
Quantum washing.
Yes. Companies are acutely aware that having quantum featured prominently in their pitch deck increases their valuation multiplier. So massive funding rounds or public valuations get categorized by analysts as quantum investment, even if a huge percentage of the company's engineers are just writing standard classical code.
Which means the baseline data that McKinsey and others use to build their massive future projections is fundamentally noisy. If the foundation is distorted by hype, the 10-year projection built on it is going to be wildly inaccurate.
This is a crucial takeaway for anyone consuming technology forecasts. Whether you are looking at quantum computing, artificial general intelligence, or next-generation energy, you have to look at probability distributions and critically examine the baselines. You cannot take stated corporate roadmaps as guaranteed facts.
And there is a great example of that credulity in the sources. Post-quantum explicitly calls out McKinsey for taking corporate timelines entirely at face value. Specifically, McKinsey cites IBM's plan to achieve fault tolerance by the year 2029.
Let's explain what fault tolerance actually means in this context, because it is the holy grail of the industry.
It really is. So right now, quantum computers are noisy. The physical qubits are incredibly delicate and prone to errors. If a stray photon hits them or there is a microscopic temperature fluctuation, they lose their quantum state. This is a process called decoherence, and when it happens, your calculation is just ruined.
So you can't run a long, complex algorithm because the machine will literally crash before it finishes the math.
Precisely. To achieve fault tolerance, you have to use error correction. This involves grouping many physical qubits together to act as a single, stable, logical qubit. The physical qubits constantly monitor each other and correct errors on the fly, keeping the logical qubits stable enough to run complex calculations indefinitely.
But the ratio of physical qubits to logical qubits is massive, isn't it?
It's daunting. Depending on the architecture, you might need 1,000 physical qubits to create just one stable logical qubit.
So when IBM publishes a roadmap saying they plan to achieve fault tolerance, meaning stable, logical qubits capable of commercial algorithms, by 2029, that implies a miraculous leap in both physics and engineering in just 3 years from now.
And as the critic points out, IBM planning fault tolerance by 2029 is a fundamentally different thing from IBM achieving it. Is it theoretically possible? Yes. Is it probable by 2029? Many physicists and engineers have serious structural doubts. A roadmap is a statement of ambition, a signal to investors. It is not a prophecy.
Right. I think we've thoroughly established that the trillion-dollar numbers are based on static baselines, and the timelines might be overly optimistic. But that doesn't mean nothing is happening. If we strip away the distant future hype, what is the actual physical reality of quantum computing right now? The McKinsey report itself admits something fascinating. The roadblocks aren't really about quantum physics anymore. The roadblocks are surprisingly mundane.
Yeah, we are watching the industry mature from a theoretical science experiment into a grinding practical engineering discipline.
Because for the past decade, the only metric the media or investors seemed to care about was qubit count. It was an arms race. Who has 50 qubits? Who has 100? Who just announced 1,000?
It was the exact equivalent of the megapixel wars in the early days of digital cameras.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison.
It was just a single, easy-to-understand number that companies could use to claim superiority, even if the actual quality of the photo, or in this case the calculation, was terrible.
But the sources agree that this technical challenge has completely shifted. The serious players have moved on from hoarding noisy qubits. They realize that scale without fidelity is a dead end. They are now entirely focused on error rates, qubit connectivity, and operational reliability.
Because 1,000 qubits that lose their state after a millisecond are essentially useless for solving a real business problem.
And to achieve that fidelity, to actually scale these machines up into something commercially viable, the real bottlenecks are no longer mysteries of theoretical physics. The McKinsey report explicitly lists the critical bottlenecks limiting progress today. They are lasers, cryogenic infrastructure, control electronics, and manufacturing processes.
We are talking about plumbing and wiring, highly advanced, unimaginable precision plumbing and wiring, but fundamentally it is standard engineering.
I want to break down how these physical machines actually work, because I think the general public still pictures a quantum computer as a glowing sci-fi cube hovering in a dark room somewhere. What does cryogenic infrastructure actually mean in the context of building a quantum computer?
Let's look at the leading modality, which is superconducting qubits. This is the approach used by companies like IBM and Google. They build circuits out of superconducting materials that only exhibit quantum properties when they are incredibly cold. And by cold, we mean temperatures very close to absolute zero, millikelvins. We are talking about temperatures colder than the ambient temperature of deep space.
Why does it have to be that cold, though?
Because of thermal noise. Heat is just atoms moving around. If there is any heat in the system, that ambient thermal energy will interact with the delicate quantum state of the qubit, causing decoherence. The superposition collapses.
Just from heat?
Just from tiny amounts of heat. So to keep the qubits isolated from the universe, they have to be placed inside massive, incredibly complex refrigeration units called dilution refrigerators.
And those work?
They work by continuously mixing two different isotopes of helium, helium-3 and helium-4, inside a sealed vacuum chamber. The process of the isotopes moving across a phase boundary absorbs heat energy from the surrounding environment, pulling the temperature down to a fraction of a degree above absolute zero.
And that is the engineering bottleneck, just building a big fridge.
Well, building one dilution refrigerator on a lab bench for a university physics experiment is one thing, but mass-producing these cryostats, ensuring they can operate flawlessly for months on end in a commercial data center, managing the incredibly complex supply chain of rare helium isotopes, and scaling the technology to house millions of qubits, that is a massive, grinding manufacturing nightmare.
The report also mentions lasers as a bottleneck. How do lasers factor into a computer?
Lasers are primarily used in different quantum architectures like trapped ion or neutral atom quantum computers. Instead of building a superconducting circuit, these machines use the actual atoms themselves as the qubits.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But atoms move. So you have to trap them in a vacuum chamber, and you use incredibly precise lasers, a field called photonics, to act as optical tweezers, holding the individual atoms perfectly still in a grid. Then you use other highly tuned lasers to pulse energy into the atoms to change their quantum states and perform the logic gates.
So you need lasers that are perfectly tuned to the exact absorption frequency of a specific atom, perfectly stable, and you need hundreds or thousands of them firing in perfect synchronization millions of times a second.
Yes. And again, building a custom optical table in a pristine academic lab is possible. Manufacturing an optical control system that is robust, affordable, and scalable enough to sit in an enterprise data center without needing constant realignment by a PhD student.
That sounds impossible.
It's not impossible, but that is a grinding, years-long engineering challenge. It is trial and error in a manufacturing plant, optimizing lens coatings and vibration dampeners.
Which means the near-term progress of this entire industry is currently limited by supply chains, manufacturing yields, and component costs, not human intellect or physics breakthroughs.
Exactly. And because these purely quantum machines are going to take years of this mundane engineering to perfect, the industry has realized they cannot wait until 2035 to start showing a return on investment. They have had to pivot their commercialization strategy right now.
Which brings us to the immediate reality of the industry, which the sources definitively agree is hybrid computing.
Yes, hybrid.
Because quantum computing was initially sold to us as a total replacement technology, a whole new paradigm that would render classical silicon chips obsolete. But the reality is far more pragmatic. Quantum isn't replacing classical computers at all. Instead, classical systems will continue to handle the bulk of the workflow, AI will orchestrate the process, and the quantum system will only be activated to handle specific, massive subproblems.
It is entirely a collaborative architecture.
I like to think of it this way. We were told quantum computing was going to replace the entire symphony orchestra with a brand new magical instrument. But that's not happening. Instead, you have a massive world-class symphony orchestra, that's your classical computing and your artificial intelligence, playing a highly complex piece of music.
I love this analogy.
Right. And for 95% of the performance, the orchestra is doing the heavy lifting perfectly. But there is one specific, mathematically impossible cadenza in the middle of the symphony. For that 2-minute stretch, the orchestra stops, and you bring out a highly specialized, incredibly temperamental soloist. That's the quantum computer. The soloist performs their incredibly complex part, hands the melody back to the orchestra, and goes back to their dressing room.
That analogy holds up perfectly in terms of systems architecture. If you look at a standard business workflow, 99% of it is classical. Moving data from a structured database, rendering a graphical user interface, applying standard Boolean logic. A quantum computer would actually be terrible and incredibly inefficient at those tasks.
Yeah.
You would never use a quantum computer to run a spreadsheet or render a web page.
So where is the soloist actually stepping onto the stage today? The McKinsey report highlights a real-world example where this hybrid approach is already being tested, and it's the travel, transport, and logistics sector.
Logistics is the perfect proving ground for hybrid systems because the industry is dominated by combinatorial optimization problems.
Let's break down what a combinatorial optimization problem actually is, because it is the key to understanding quantum's immediate value.
It's a problem where you are trying to find the best possible solution from a finite set of options, but the number of options grows exponentially as you add more variables. The classic example is the traveling salesperson problem. If you have a delivery truck that needs to drop off 5 packages at 5 different addresses, there are 120 possible routes. A classical computer can check all 120 in a fraction of a second and pick the shortest one.
But what happens when the truck has 50 packages?
Well, if you have to deliver 50 packages to 50 addresses, the number of possible routes is a number with 64 zeros behind it. There are more possible routes than there are atoms in the observable universe.
That is insane.
It is. A classical computer, no matter how powerful, cannot brute force check every single route. It would take billions of years. So classical systems use heuristics, which are educated guesses and approximations, to find a good enough route.
So how does the quantum computer find the perfect route?
This is where we go back to superposition and interference. A quantum algorithm maps all those possible routes into a quantum state. Because of superposition, the quantum computer is, in a very loose sense, evaluating the entire landscape of possibility simultaneously.
Okay.
All at once.
Yeah.
Yes, but the real magic is interference. The algorithm is designed so that the wrong answers, the longer routes, destructively interfere with each other, canceling each other out like waves hitting each other in a pool. Meanwhile, the right answers constructively interfere, amplifying their probability. When you finally measure the system, it collapses into the highly optimized answer.
So in a real-world logistics company today, they use classical systems to track the physical trucks via GPS. They use classical AI to monitor the weather patterns, and they use standard software to manage driver payroll. But they take that impossibly complex mathematical knot, figuring out the absolute optimal route with dynamic traffic constraints, and they hand that specific sub-problem to the quantum algorithm.
The quantum system finds a route that is highly optimized, a route that the classical approximation completely missed, and it hands that single answer back to the classical IT system to execute on the driver's dashboard.
And, as McKinsey notes, in global logistics, even a fractional percentage improvement in routing efficiency translates to massive fuel savings, lower maintenance costs, and increased cargo capacity. That fractional improvement entirely justifies the cost of hiring the quantum soloist.
But if we connect this hybrid reality back to the broader business landscape, it fundamentally changes how the technology is sold. You are no longer selling a standalone magic box that sits in the corner. You are selling an integrated component that has to talk seamlessly to existing classical IT infrastructure.
Which means solving all those engineering bottlenecks we discussed earlier, mass-producing the cryogenic fridges, stabilizing the lasers, and building software translation layers that can smoothly hand data back and forth between classical processors and quantum processors requires a massive supply chain, and above all, capital.
A staggering amount of capital, which fundamentally shifts the profile of who is involved in this industry.
Let's dig into that shift, because building the infrastructure for these hybrid systems is shifting the center of gravity in the quantum world. The QEVC report gives us the hard financial numbers on the state of the global quantum industry in 2025. and the money is pouring in from new directions. Total global public funding jumped by $12.7 billion in 2025, reaching a total commitment of $56.7 billion.
Governments are clearly awake. They view quantum leadership as a critical matter of national security and economic sovereignty.
But the private sector is accelerating even faster than the public sector. Private venture capital hit $4.9 billion in 2025. That is a massive 310% increase from 2024. But here is the critical structural shift that McKinsey identified, and this is a massive change. 72% of quantum computing adoption is now occurring at privately owned entities.
That is a staggering statistic when you look at the historical context.
Just 5 or 6 years ago, this entire field was dominated almost exclusively by public sector research labs, university physics departments, and government defense agencies. Now, it's corporate enterprises driving the use cases.
And they aren't just dipping their toes in the water with small pilot programs. The corporate budgets allocated for internal quantum development are exploding.
According to the analysis of the 200 companies surveyed, 33% of them are spending over $10 million annually on quantum initiatives. 7% are spending over $50 million a year. And the absolute largest individual corporate budget they identified was hitting $200 million annually, purely dedicated to quantum research and integration.
When a single global corporation allocates $500 million a year to a specific technology, they have moved past funding abstract science projects. They are demanding a near-term return on investment. They are expecting integration.
But this raises a huge logistical question. We just spent a significant amount of time detailing how deeply complex the physical hardware is. We talk about dilution refrigerators chilling things to absolute zero and massive vibration-proof manufacturing facilities for photonics. If the hardware is that finicky and that expensive to build, how are corporate end users driving adoption? How does a mid-sized bank or an average global logistics firm actually operate one of these things? Do they have to build a multi-million-dollar cryogenics lab next to their IT department?
No. And that is the beauty of how the commercial market has evolved to solve this problem. The end users aren't operating the physical hardware at all.
So they aren't buying machines.
No. The dominant commercial model that has emerged, completely unlocking corporate adoption, is quantum as a service.
It's the exact same business model as SaaS, software as a service, but applied to quantum mechanics.
Exactly. It completely democratizes access to the technology. Instead of a logistics company spending $20 million in capital expenditures to buy a massive cryogenic hardware setup and then hiring a dedicated team of PhD physicists to maintain it and hope it doesn't break, they simply buy access to the machine over the cloud.
And who are they buying that access from?
Through the major cloud computing providers they are likely already deeply integrated with. Platforms like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud.
So the hardware providers, the companies actually building the physical machines like IBM, IonQ, or Quantinuum, are shifting away from trying to sell physical boxes to corporations.
Yeah.
Instead, they keep their massive freezing laser-filled machines in their own highly controlled, specialized data centers, and they plug them into the major cloud networks.
And the logistics company just sends their mathematical knot over the internet. The quantum computer in a data center thousands of miles away solves the problem and sends the answer back. It converts what would be a massive capital expenditure into a manageable operating expense. You just pay for the compute time you actually use.
McKinsey notes that this marks the critical evolution of the market from doing bespoke research pilots into offering a scalable technology stack. But it's not just the hardware builders and the massive cloud providers making this work. There is a whole new ecosystem of pure software companies springing up in the middle to make the cloud model actually function.
Companies like Classic and Zapata Quantum are prime examples of this crucial middle layer.
What exactly do these software companies do in the QIAS model?
They are building the compilers and the orchestration tools. Remember earlier when we talked about the value gap and how difficult it is to translate a business problem into quantum mechanics? These software companies are building the translation layers. They create high-level software tools that allow a standard enterprise software engineer to define their optimization problem using familiar code. The software then automatically translates that problem down into the highly specific pulse-level control instructions needed to run the physical qubits.
So the end user never even has to learn quantum physics.
That is the ultimate goal of the industry. If quantum as a service succeeds, The corporate end user will just know that their logistics software is suddenly much faster and much more powerful. They won't need to know or care whether the calculation ran on a classical silicon processor or a quantum processor in the cloud. The complexity is entirely abstracted away.
But while the cloud makes quantum computing accessible anywhere in the world, like a supply chain manager in Brazil can access a superconducting machine in New York, the actual intellectual property, the startups building the tech, and the funding are deeply concentrated in very specific geographical regions.
And that deep concentration of intellectual property and talent is sparking a quiet but incredibly intense global geopolitical race.
Which brings us to the global quantum map. We are going to look impartially at the data reported by QEDC and the geopolitical analysis from All About Industries to see how different regions of the world are positioning themselves for this future. Because the national strategies playing out right now are wildly different from one another.
It is absolutely not a monolithic global industry. The approaches are highly fractured by national interests and different philosophies of economic development.
Let's start by looking at the transatlantic divide, the United States versus Europe. According to the data, the U.S. absolutely dominates in private venture capital funding and in establishing pure-play market leaders. The numbers show that 64% of all global quantum investments flow directly into U.S. startups. The U.S. is currently home to 164 pure-play quantum companies.
It is the classic Silicon Valley model applied directly to quantum mechanics.
The post-quantum analysis characterizes the U.S. approach as funding moonshot startups. It is heavy venture capital backing, bold, highly risky, pure-play hardware and software companies that are aiming to build the ultimate fault-tolerant machine.
It is a high-risk, high-reward strategy. The U.S. is relying on private capital markets to place bets, weather the failures, and ultimately pick the winners.
But Europe presents a completely different model. Despite the massive U.S. dominance in venture capital, Europe actually leads the world in adoption and corporate readiness. The European Union is home to 173 pure-play companies, edging out the U.S. in total number, but more importantly, they have a significantly larger trained workforce. The EU boasts 6,420 quantum workers compared to the U.S.'s 4,401.
That workforce number is a critical indicator of long-term stability and integration capability.
So why the discrepancy in strategies? Post-Quantum notes that while the U.S. is busy building standalone startups hoping to become the next tech unicorn, European industrial giants are focusing on building internal capabilities. They're integrating quantum research directly into their massive legacy industries.
We're talking about companies like Siemens, Volkswagen, Airbus, and major chemical engineering firms. The European model is less about creating a standalone quantum behemoth and more about ensuring that their foundational industries have the quantum tools they need to remain globally competitive in automotive design, aerospace engineering, and material science over the next 20 years. It is a long-term industrial policy.
However, All About Industries issues a stark warning regarding the European strategy. They note that despite this high level of industrial readiness, Europe's window to lead the broader global commercial market is closing rapidly because they simply lack the massive venture capital scaling mechanisms that the U.S. possesses.
It is a fascinating race between the blistering innovation speed of the U.S. venture model and the deep practical industrial integration of the European model.
But both the U.S. and Europe might be looking over their shoulders, because then we have the staggering rise of Asia. The reports show that China is catching up massively, and they are doing it through a completely different mechanism. China currently leads the entire world in active patents. They account for over half of the 69,807 active global quantum patents.
Over half the world's intellectual property in this space is currently being patented in China. That represents a foundational, structural lock on the future commercialization of the technology.
And unlike the U.S., this effort is heavily state-funded. China leads the world in public funding, having committed a massive $15.3 billion.
This is a top-down, state-led effort to secure sovereignty over what they view as a critical future technology. They aren't relying on the whims of venture capital to decide what gets built. The state is aggressively directing the research, funding the laboratories, and systematically locking down the foundational patents.
And it's not just China driving the Asian market. Japan is actually the second largest public funder globally, committing $7.9 billion to their own quantum initiatives. In fact, if we look at the countries with the fastest growth in public funding just in the year 2025 alone, the map reveals a global awakening. Spain grew their public funding by an astonishing 1,796% in a single year. Japan grew by 1,030%, and Switzerland grew by 1,009%.
Governments everywhere are recognizing the stakes and opening their national checkbooks to avoid being left behind.
So if we synthesize all of this, it sounds like we have three totally different massive global strategies playing out simultaneously on the world stage. The U.S. is utilizing private venture capital to build pure-play startup unicorns. Europe is utilizing industrial policy to integrate the technology directly into its existing legacy manufacturing and engineering sectors. And China is utilizing state-led funding efforts to aggressively lock down the foundational intellectual property and secure a patent monopoly.
That is an accurate, impartial reading of the geopolitical landscape based on the data. And what makes this moment in history so fascinating is that no single strategy has definitively proven itself to be the winner yet.
Because they all have profound strengths, but also significant vulnerabilities. The U.S. model is highly innovative, but it risks a massive financial bubble bursting if hardware timelines slip and VC money suddenly dries up. The European model is stable and practical, but it risks moving too slowly and being out-innovated by nimble, well-funded U.S. startups. And the Chinese model secures intellectual property, but it risks global isolation and a lack of integration with broader commercial markets.
But despite these intensely nationalistic strategies and the race for sovereignty, the QEDC report highlights a powerful countertrend. They note that the United Nations designated 2025 as the International Year of Quantum Science and Technology.
Which might sound like just a ceremonial UN title, but the report emphasizes that it serves a vital purpose in reality. Because despite the geopolitical friction and the desire to build domestic capabilities, international collaboration remains absolutely essential for this technology to actually work. Why? Because the physical supply chain we talked about earlier is simply too complex for any one nation to entirely isolate.
You cannot build a walled garden in quantum computing right now. The expertise, the raw materials, and the manufactured components are too globally distributed. A U.S. software company might design the quantum algorithm, which runs on a superconducting chip manufactured in Asia, which is housed inside a dilution refrigerator built by a specialized engineering firm in Europe. To cut off international collaboration in an attempt to protect your domestic industry would be to severely bottleneck your own progress.
The global supply chain is physically and economically entangled, to borrow a quantum term.
It is the defining characteristic of deep tech supply chains.
So as we pull all of these threads together, let's move from the grand global stage back down to your individual perspective as the listener. We started this deep dive with a specific mission to separate the boardroom hype from the physical reality of quantum computing here in 2026.
And we've covered a tremendous amount of ground to achieve that.
We really have. We've stripped away the staggering $2.7 trillion economic value projections, noting how those numbers often rely on static baselines that completely ignore the rapid, ongoing advancement of classical artificial intelligence. We found that beneath the dizzying financial hype, there is a very practical hybrid technology emerging.
A technology that is currently limited not by the incomprehensible mysteries of quantum mechanics, but by incredibly mundane physical engineering challenges like mass-producing reliable lasers and scaling cryogenic infrastructure.
And we've seen how the entire field is being fueled by a massive influx of private capital, shifting the center of power away from university government labs and into corporate boardrooms. This is being driven almost entirely by the highly accessible quantum-as-a-service cloud model. All of this is happening while a fierce, three-pronged geopolitical race plays out between the U.S., Europe, and Asia to secure the talent and the intellectual property.
The industry has officially entered its messy, vital stage of commercial adolescence. It is moving from the whiteboard to the data center.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. Since the winning commercial model clearly seems to be quantum as a service, where quantum algorithms are quietly integrated into classical workflows to act as a highly specialized invisible soloist, the true quantum revolution will likely be entirely invisible to you. You are never going to buy a quantum laptop at a consumer electronics store.
The transition will be entirely seamless.
Your logistics routing software, or your financial portfolio forecasting tools, or the drug discovery process for your daily medication will just certainly, inexplicably, get much better and much faster one day. So consider this. Is your own company or an industry that you rely on every single day already quietly feeding its hardest, most mathematically complex subproblems into a quantum cloud via AWS or Azure without you even knowing it? The tipping point might not be a massive global explosion. It might just be a quiet structural upgrade to the world's operating system. Something to think about the next time your GPS finds a miraculously traffic-free route. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Question the multi-trillion-dollar hype. Keep an eye on the mundane engineering and prepare for the invisible hybrid reality.